Thank you, Jim. It's great to be here with the RPA, even though it is virtual. I was looking forward to being able to meet people in person, but unfortunately, that isn't possible this year. I'd like to thank you first and foremost for the support from the RPA, because over time, I think it's been a really critical part of Amtrak survival, and it's also really helped us have that political framework that was so important to get us to this point where we can be talking about a lot of really exciting things coming up in the future. But perhaps we should kind of reflect a little bit about what happened in the past year and a half. When we sat here maybe a bit more than a year ago, we really didn't know what was going to happen. We had been looking at ridership that had dropped off by 97% at the worst point in time. We didn't know how fast people were going to come back. We didn't even know if we were going to be getting the money from Congress that we eventually got to help us sustain our operations. Anyway, so if we go to the first slide, please. It really speaks to what I just mentioned about we didn't know where we would be starting from. And over on the left-hand side of the chart is where we were sitting when we were planning for the future. And the recovery has been much, much stronger than we expected. And if you look at that line going up from about March, April of this past year, you'll see that we've been on this really tremendous trajectory. And that was a really pleasant surprise. It didn't come without a lot of hard work, but it was quite a surprise. If we go to the next slide, please. I'd like to talk a little bit about long distance and what has been going on there, because I know that that's near to the heart of many of you in the audience. As I said, originally we didn't know how many passengers would really want to travel during the pandemic. We didn't know how bad the public health emergency would be, and we didn't know how bad our funding situation would get. So we made some very difficult decisions early on, and some of them were very controversial, and we knew that. And I'm sure you're all very well aware that we did reduce service to 3 times a week for last winter. And that was designed to preserve cash until we knew what our funding outlook would be in the longer term. And it was also an effort to try to make sure that as much as possible, all of the country continued to receive the essential service that we provide. And that did work out better than we expected, in part because what we found was a lot of our sleeping car customers, which we had feared we might lose with a less than daily schedule, actually traveled much more than we expected, because long distance private rooms were seen as a very safe way to travel during the pandemic. But this, anyway, so the combination of the funding approach and the schedule changes allowed us to keep the operation running as much as possible. And the funding really helped us keep a lot of our employees ready to return to work when we saw the conditions merited it, which come spring was very much the case. So once we had the funding in place, we already had our employees ready to come back. And as you'll remember, around Memorial Day, starting in the beginning of June, we restored daily service across the country. And we brought all of our employees back to active service. Some of them had been on the extra boards, but really we were in a situation where we could bring everybody back and provide full service. We also took an opportunity, and I'll talk about it in a minute, we took an opportunity to enhance our products in a lot of areas, because we realized that we had a kind of this pivotal point where we had a lot of attention on the products. We had the support of Congress, we had money, and people were willing to pay higher fares, actually, which is kind of interesting. So we realized that it was really important, in order to maintain the momentum, that we invested in the product and made it a better value for money proposition going forward. We also did a few things to build out what we think is kind of our mission to provide access and transportation across the country. We took what had been our legacy paper USA Rail Pass. We turned it into a digital version, which we thought was going to be much more popular in terms of usability. And that turned out to be a massive hit too. So really happy that we were able to roll that out and provide easier mobility, not only for existing customers, but we think for large numbers of future customers as well. The other thing that was very successful during COVID was AutoTrain. That really has hit all-time highs in terms of performance. And again, going back to the fact that it offers primarily private rooms, and it gets people off the roads. So it kind of hits a couple of different missions that we have, including being more environmentally friendly. Go to the next page, please. So a few things on the product improvements that we were able to make. I think this is some of the area that I'm personally most proud of, because all through COVID, we continued to work on a lot of the projects that we were planning to do in the coming years. And this is what really enabled us to make some exciting changes as we came out of the depths of the pandemic in the spring. And here's where we had a unveiling, I think in June it was, in Chicago, where we showed off some of this stuff. But this is really the kind of the relaunch of the long distance service, where we went out there and we said, look, we're going to go out, and on the Western trains, we're going to restore traditional dining. And we started there because we need to make sure that we know how it works. It's also the places where we have the greatest ability to restore the levels of employees on the trains that are necessary to provide the dining service. And also it's the places with the longest schedule periods, typically 2 days on board, where dining is such a critical part of the experience. We really wanted to live up to the expectations of our customers there. We also introduced new soft goods across the network, and I think we should all be done now. We spent the beginning of September rolling out soft goods across all train routes, all sleeping car train routes. So that includes new blankets, new pillows, new comforters, anything that the customer really touches and feels while they're in the sleeping car compartment. We also put into service our first ALC 42, the first of the new generation long distance locomotives. Superliner and Viewliner, well, initially Superliner refresh we unveiled, so replacing all of the seating surfaces, cushions, carpets, drapes in all the Superliner equipment, the coaches, the sleeping cars, the lounges, the diners. And eventually we'll be doing the same thing on the Viewliner 1 sleeping cars. Viewliner 2 sleeping cars also have been being gradually put into service over the past year or so, starting on the Florida sleepers. We've now rolled them out to the Lakeshore Limited as well. We've received all 25 of the new cars, so there will be no more coming from that order, but it was a great thing to be able to put those 25 new cars into service. And we continue to work on other enhancements for long distance, including we're working to put together a pilot program to see how best we can reintroduce Wi-Fi on the Superliner equipment, something which we had some pilot products a couple of years ago, but it really wasn't sustainable on a long-term basis. But we want to figure out how we can do it going forward, because we realize that that's a product feature that's greatly missed or wanted by a lot of our customers who are out there for a couple of days on the road. Go to the next slide, please. So what's next for long distance? So as I think you're all aware, there's $16 billion in the National Network Grant. And perhaps one of the most energizing things in this is that it really gives us, for the first chance, an opportunity and a certainty to think about replacing the long distance fleet. Primarily the superliner fleet. You know that it's quite old now. So the oldest part of the fleet we had before was the AM fleets. We just finished the ICT procurement for those. So the new Siemens train sets that we ordered will replace all the AM Fleet 1 equipment. And now the next stage will be to look at the Superliner 1s, which are essentially the second oldest fleet that we have and really need to be replaced in the longer run. So the refurbishment I just talked about is kind of a stopgap that will get us through the next several years before we can get an RFP executed for new long distance equipment. And then we'll have to, of course, it'll take several years to build out the new fleet. So we're probably looking late in the decade before we can get any kind of a new long distance fleet in service. But it's just an incredible time for us to rethink how to deliver the long distance experience, how to do it in a modern environment, how to make sure that the employees have the right tools and equipment on board to really deliver the kind of service that they and we would be proud of. Next slide, please. Northeast Corridor. So we have a lot of stuff going on there. We had to get really creative during COVID because the Northeast Corridor was the area where our business was most heavily negatively impacted. Not only was it hit hard from COVID itself, but also a lot of the business travel that we rely on in the Northeast Corridor just completely stopped. And we kind of met the needs of the market by essentially running a combined NER Acela schedule much of the time, and having to get really kind of creative on a pricing perspective and think about how the two products live together. And it really helped us think about how to approach the market in the long run, how to go out there and appeal to an entirely new segment of customers who are more price sensitive, who tend to be younger, and invest in the future of Amtrak, because these aren't people who we would necessarily have been going out and looking for prior to COVID, because the trains were really full. We were really constrained by capacity. And so we've been really excited about the fact that we've been able to attract hundreds of thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of new customers a month to Amtrak. And it's really our mission now to make sure that we can retain them, because we're going to be implementing the new Acela train sets in the near future. They're considerably larger than the current ones. They're also greater in number, so we're going to have a huge increase in the Acela capacity. And then, of course, later in the decade, we're going to have the new Siemens rolling stock, which will replace the AM fleets. So the future is about growth, and we've been rethinking exactly how we position Amtrak and how we price it in the Northeast Corridor. So really exciting there. We've also taken some other creative steps, including reintroducing sleeping car service on the overnight train that runs up and down the corridor between Washington and Boston. And that's actually far exceeded our expectations, and something that we look to keep in the foreseeable future. Although clearly there will be challenges that we have to work through as we get the new train sets that replace the AM fleets, and we're going to have to think about how we would be able to support sleeping car service in that environment, but that's many years away still. So I think what we're really focused on now is how to bring the new Acellas on board next year, how to think about having a very deliberate Acela and Northeast regional strategy for the future, and how to kind of continue to adapt to the COVID environment, because I don't think there's any chance that things will go back to exactly the way they were before COVID. Hopefully they'll get back to 80 or 90% of how they were, but it won't be really the same ever, I think. Next slide, please. So one thing that has been a great success too has been our rollout of our future vision of Amtrak Connects Us, as we call it. And you see mapped there of the proposal that we put out, which really lays out what we think could be done with the funding that Congress has made available. And we had spent a lot of time getting ready for this because we wanted to be the first out of the gate to be able to set some of the discussion and dialogue around what was possible, because we knew there were a lot of people who were looking for guidance or leadership on this. And it's just been so exciting to see so many different parts of the country be interested in what the future is and what is possible. So hugely encouraging. And, you know, I would just like to thank all the people, including, you know, members of RPA, states, and the general public, in terms of contributing to the vision and also then helping facilitate the dialogue that has come out of the proposal. Next. So what is next for Amtrak and for growing service and rail service in general in the US? So coming out of the infrastructure bill, it's become really apparent that the model in the future will be for Amtrak and the FRA really to work together to put forward the best projects with the best prioritization possible so that we can get things done. And this is, I think, a really healthy outcome, because it's going to require a lot of dialogue to make sure that there's buy-in from all sides on what needs to be done and when. Of course, it's going to require probably more dialogue, but I do think that's healthy. We are going to establish with the FRA a project pipeline of projects 18 months after enactment. We've already got some teed up. There are some projects that are coming out of the gates really fast. So you'll see here on this slide, we have the New Orleans to Mobile service, that the Gulf Coast service that we're working on, and is actually moving forward pretty quickly with some decisions by the STB just recently. We're working with the state of Vermont on the Ethan Allen extension to Burlington, which we hope to have up and running next spring. So that will be in addition to the Vermonter that stops in Essex Junction near to Burlington, where we have all the funding in place for the TCMC, Twin Cities, Milwaukee, Chicago service, which we're also working on. The Berkshire Flyer as well, weekend service to Western Massachusetts, and then working with the Commonwealth of Virginia to implement a second Roanoke service and an additional third Norfolk service, hopefully next spring as well. So these are really tangible outcomes, not necessarily directly related to the infrastructure bill, because we have been working on them already, but they're things that have been made more able through funding and dialogue that has gone into this whole process. And I think it's really important that we're able to get these early runs on the board to show the country how and where rail can expand service and provide added utility. Because if it takes us 5 years to get the first project done, I think people are going to lose interest. So I personally am very, very focused on getting what we can done early to kind of build that and maintain that interest and credibility across the political spectrum. Next slide. But for all the good news, we still have a lot of challenges that confront us. And some of them are our kind of favorite talking points about host access and preference. They're things that we continue to need support politically on, also from the RPA membership. We have been bedeviled by delays from our freight partners. It was great during a lot of COVID because freight railroad volumes were down, and therefore we had actually great access to the host railroad infrastructure that we use for a lot of our passenger services, and we really appreciated that. But as shipping has come back and in fact become really congested on the freight side, we've encountered a lot more delays, and that has been really concerning for us, because you can see here that we've had some really, really poor on-time performance in some of our long distance trains in recent months since the economy has begun to pick up again. So we continue to need support, not only for on-time performance, and we do have some opportunities there with metrics and standards, but we also will, in order to build out our vision of rail in the future in the US, really need help in terms of being able to enforce our rights of access across our host railroads. And I think that concludes our presentation, and I'd like to rejoin Jim to take some questions from the audience.
Roger, thank you. That was solid as always. So many questions occurred to me. We do have some questions that have been forwarded to us from some of our most engaged members and some of our elected leadership within our organization. But before I turn to that, I did kind of want to pose a little bit of a question on the superliner side. That feels like a big challenge to me. You know, from an industrial base point of view, you know, I'm assuming that from the economics of it would probably want to lean more towards replacing bi-level equipment with bi-level equipment. But if that's the case, do we really have the industrial base in this country to support that? I'm not convinced that we do. It just feels like it's got to get done, and I know Amtrak's committed to doing it, but boy, you got a lot of challenges there to knock down to get that done.
Yeah, no, Jim, it's a great question, and it has multiple dimensions, because, you know, not only is it a question of economics, and not only is it a question of the industrial base, but it's also a question of whether or not there are vendors who are willing to take on the task. And I don't want to presuppose the answer, but there's a lot of risk with these major programs. And the superliner design in particular is something that's very unique to the US, and it's iconic for Amtrak. But because it is so unique, it also means that it has a limited set of suppliers who are willing to take on the challenge, or even have the capability. So yeah, no, huge challenge. And I think it's really exciting, because we're going to be able to, I think, put a lot of thought process and invite a lot of input into what's possible. Or what's desired, and then we will be constrained somewhat by what's possible.
Sure.
But it's exciting. It's once in a generation.
It really is. It is exciting, and I know from our members' point of view, you know, very old fleet, and being able to kind of look ahead to the future and not just kind of MacGyver our way through getting this equipment out on the road. I think that's terrific. So we're ready to support, and we're ready to help in any way we can. So I want to turn to some of the questions that we've had submitted. Our first question comes from Steve Roberts in California, and I'll turn it over to Steve.
Good afternoon. My name is Steve Roberts, and I'm an RPA council member from Northern California. One of the great concerns of RPA members are what appear to be artificially small consists on the long distance trains. In lieu of dorm cars, crews utilize sleeping car line space, reducing capacity. Trains are being operated with one coach and one coach baggage car, reducing the availability of lower level seating for disabled and elderly riders. This limited capacity results in some very high fares. RPA members and Amtrak customers in general find themselves unable to travel because space is not available or because they are priced out of the product. And no extra cars are added during the high demand periods. These potential riders and their representatives who signed up to pay for the continuation of Amtrak's service don't feel they are getting full value for their investment. What is the reason for this? Is this a continuation of the strategy of constraining capacity to maximize yield by revenue managing riders into the highest fare buckets? Or like American and other airlines, did Amtrak fall behind the curve when travel demand ramped up last spring and there was not enough time to retrain crews and bring equipment back online? If this is a maintenance crew issue, what is the plan for recovery? Or if this is an aggressive yield strategy with limited capacity or high fares, what is the rationalization for it? Either way, can we look forward to robust consists, affordable fares being available during the upcoming holiday season? Thank you for the opportunity to discuss these issues with you.
Thanks, Steve. I think that's a very fair question and kind of a complicated answer, but let me take a shot at it. So as I mentioned earlier, 18 months ago when we had to plan for what our strategy was for working through COVID, we had to decide how much fleet we were going to be able to run, how much money we would spend on the overhauls that were necessary, and how many employees we thought would be able to work on the equipment. And so some of the equipment was designated to be in temporary storage because we didn't have enough demand to justify, and we didn't think we would have enough money from Congress at that point in time to keep the system running at the levels that we historically had it running at. So some of the equipment was put in temporary storage, and this had the effect of reducing our overhaul requirements during the period. And we also had some limitations in terms of COVID workplace, the ability to get work done in some of the shops due to COVID workplace restrictions and the number of employees who were out for medical leave. So we had also a reduced ability to do overhauls. And so this has effectively limited the fleet that we have available today. So what you see scheduled and running on the system is all of the equipment that we effectively have available. So we're not holding any back. We have a backlog of maintenance work that needs to be done because of the storage decision that was made at that point in time. And this is compounded by the fact that we're running into the same employee or recruiting challenges that the rest of America had. So we had some employees who decided to leave us due to early retirement and things like that during COVID. So we have a reduced mechanical base. We have to go out and re-recruit for some of those people. And then we have to work through the backlog of maintenance that accumulated because of reduced production during COVID. So there is this sort of, unintended effect, but at this point unavoidable, where we have to work through this backlog to get back to what was our historic fleet availability. And that will take some time. And it's unfortunate, and it frustrates me as much as many other people, but there are plans to try to get all of that equipment back in service, but it will take some time.
Okay, thank you for that. Our next question, I have to say, I share the enthusiasm a lot of our members have for what we saw in the Amtrak Connects Us map. Our question from Bruce Ashton, who's one of our most prolific advocates down in Texas. He asks,
thank you, Roger, for taking our questions. My question is, how do you see Amtrak members becoming actively engaged in advocating for Amtrak's vision plan? From my perspective, I am hoping together we can really generate overwhelming support for these proposals. We are also faced with the fact that each region inherently has unique community characteristics. As such, the presentation of messages about goals may differ from long distance routes than those from the corridor service. My concerns are based on my personal experience with working with RPA's initial Daily Sunset campaign and my observation of community reactions to past Amtrak press releases. While both do generate sparks of interest, we are all settled with the fact that we are faced with prolonged periods of unseen actions, which over time dilutes community support. So how do we work together to really front load support for this vision and to keep it going? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Bruce. I think it's a great point, because one of the things that we've identified as a critical success factor with making this work throughout the country is having the level of local support that you describe. And so I think it behooves all of us to figure out how to make sure that you can support us in the most effective way and the most consistent way, so that there's consistency between Amtrak, between RPA and local advocates and local government, so that there is no daylight between us in terms of our effectiveness in lobbying and pushing forward on these opportunities. So what I would propose is that we work with RPA to figure out how to do exactly that, how to create consistent materials that are exhaustive and accurate as much as we know, and remain fresh and up to date, so that we all look like we are well coordinated, which I think we will be, because one of the risks that we run is that we all pull in our enthusiasm, we all pull in different directions, and we end up actually being less effective than we would want to be. And let's face it, there are many people out there who don't want us to be successful because they have a different agenda. And those people will find this opportunity to drive wedges between us. And I don't think we can afford to do that. So let me take that back to our team and figure out how we can help Jim and the RPA team to be completely linked up on this, and where we are actually creating material that is useful and efficient and effective.
That's great. Thank you. Our next question comes from Jim Tilley, who is another incredibly effective advocate we have in Florida. And so I'll turn this over to Jim Tilley.
My name is Jim Tilley, and I'm the Florida representative on the National Council. I'm one of many communicating Florida-centric aspects of Connect US, including countering misinformation. EFR subpart C stipulates accessibility requirements for the inner city rail cars. What initiatives are being pursued to obtain any waivers from regulatory restrictions that prevent the dormitory baggage viewliner combination cars from entering revenue service? Alternatively, are modifications planned? Florida DOT owns trackage from Palatka or DeLand, Florida to just south of Orlando, Kissimmee, and also the trackage from West Palm Beach to Miami. The Chrissy grant was awarded 2 years ago for Amtrak to take title to the route between DeLand and Palatka, which basically provides for state or Amtrak ownership of approximately half the mileage between Jacksonville and Miami. Train 97 and 98 are the trains that provide the most direct service, and Connect US proposes to add several train starts to that route. What are Amtrak's plans to leverage on this public ownership to initiate that service?
Thank you, Jim, and good questions, and thanks for your enthusiasm in the state of Florida. Well, as it happens, Florida DOT actually has reached out to us and asked us how they can get involved, because they're interested in how rail can be a solution to transportation challenges in the state. So we had a kickoff call the other day with them. We need to figure out where we can make some of that the common ground produce a service. I don't know. I think because there is no historic service in no historic state supported service in the state of Florida, it's probably going to take a little bit longer for us to figure out how and where we can do it. But certainly when you look at where we have short distance ridership on our long distance trains, passenger volumes within the state of Florida, so between Miami and Tampa, Miami, Tampa, Orlando, all the way up to Jacksonville, just like you mentioned, are really substantial. And so they speak to an opportunity to be able to do some kind of experimental service initially, and it wouldn't be that hard. But those are the kinds of things that we're looking at with them. And it's really good news that Florida DOT is interested in it. To be honest with you, we were really pleasantly surprised. In terms of the rolling stock, as I said, we are constrained by the capacity to overhaul the rolling stock that we have. So not all the rolling stock that you see out there today is necessarily available for service at this point in time. As we start introducing some of the venture cars in the Midwest, we currently have 42 on the property, and they're kind of hung up on some technical issues before they can be put into service, but they will release a comparable number of Horizons, some of which will be going to the Pacific Northwest to support Cascade service, some of which will be earmarked for things like the Gulf Coast service, but there will be coaches that will come off of those Midwest routes in the coming year or two. And some of them will be available for other services.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have another question around ADA compliance. 13 out of 312 stations in need of repair to meet ADA compliance have been completed so far. What is the timeline for the compliance project to be completed? How is Amtrak sharing each completion of each station with the public?
So in answer to that question, we have 149 stations around the system that are either partially or completely ADA compliant at this point. So 79 of those 149 are completely finished. Clearly when we have a base of 500, we still have a lot to do, but our plan is that we will have the full program completed by 2027, and we're spending somewhere in the region of $80 to $100 million a year on our stations accessibility program. So really substantial progress, but there's a lot to do, and I think that's really the biggest impediment to getting there prior to 2027, which sounds like a long way away, but that is our commitment to get the whole system compliant. And in terms of how we share them, we have quarterly updates with the disability community, and we every quarter share with them our progress on completion of station projects, and probably we can look for ways to communicate that more broadly as well.
Okay, Roger, thank you. Our next set of questions comes from Dan Bilka, who is a great guy and recently elected to our board of directors, and is doing great work out in the Mountain West. We'll go ahead and turn ourselves to Dan.
Hello, this is Dan Bilka, a board member with the Rail Passengers Association, also a board member with the Colorado Rail Passengers Association, and former South Dakota representative for Rail Passengers. I have a few questions here. First, leading off is regarding operations. I too will agree with the comments about unduly short consists. I've heard about the Empire Builder and Southwest Chief, as well as experiencing it myself on the California Zephyr in July. Sold out limited consists, driving up prices. When I was on the Zephyr, it was completely sold out eastbound. I know of an elderly couple that wanted to take the train from Charlotte, North Carolina to Houston, Texas, because flying is terribly uncomfortable at their ages, and they do have the time to travel by train. But the prices were atrocious, even for a roomette compared to a bedroom, so that they finally relented to flying at the behest of their kids. I will also note that there are crew shortages, so would like to ask what Amtrak leadership is doing to address these concerns. Regarding equipment maintenance and cleaning, what is Amtrak doing for maintenance and cleaning of existing equipment on all routes and specifically the long distance corridors? I've heard numerous mentions of broken equipment and cleanliness issues from members of the public while engaging on outreach and engagement in the Greater West. And from an unnamed Amtrak crew person, quote, "Maintenance failures are way too common. Whatever we are doing now is not working. Think outside the box and look for new management systems to get maintenance of long distance trains together so that toilets, air conditioning, PA systems, food service machinery, and cleanliness improve dramatically and immediately. The problem is no longer excusable by old equipment," end quote. Regarding onboard services, I appreciate the returning of full diner service on the Western routes, but note it still needs to be open to coach passengers and that the menu is currently the same on every route. What is Amtrak doing to promote regional diversity options on the menu and opening of the dining car to all passengers, including coach?
Hey, thanks, Dan. So a lot of really good points you make there. And I think two things that I think really address what you're talking about. First thing is we really want to put power into the frontline employees' hands in terms of trying to get a lot of this stuff fixed. So we've just rolled out, I think it's about 300 handheld devices to our OBS LSA community. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with what the conductors already have, but they have this device which they use to scan tickets. And it also is enabled with various apps that give them access to things like delay information and all kinds of communication with the Central Control Center in Wilmington. And a lot of other things that help them do their job better and give information to customers on the trains. So by rolling this out to our OBS employees, we're giving them the same kind of information that the conductors have. So this is part of getting the information out there. But what's really important to your point about this is that there's a tool in there that enables them or gives them the ability to report all and any mechanical problems or anything that needs to be repaired on their train that gets logged automatically and creates a work order automatically in the mechanical shops where the train is going to. So prior to this, it was necessary for things to be written up on paper, that the tickets would be collected by mechanical when they got to the shops, and then the people would have to make sure they had a part and plan the work. And what this new device will do is it will allow the pre-planning of this work, making sure that parts are available, people are available, the work orders are set up. And so it will also enable us to introduce a much higher level of accountability in terms of getting all this work done too, because the work orders will be pre-populated, and I think you'll get a much more robust reporting and repair process out of this. So I think that's the first thing. And then secondly, as to opening up traditional dining to non-sleeping car passengers, what we really wanted to make sure we did with the reintroduction of traditional dining is make sure that we could do it right in the first place. And because of limited crews and because it was a new service, we did not want to overly burden our OBS employees with having to deal with coach passengers and COVID restrictions and everything else at the same time. So we made a very deliberate decision that we would restrict it to sleeping car customers initially, make sure that we could get the service right, that we could harden the service, we could deliver it reliably. And then our intention all along was to get to a point where we could begin to offer it to coach customers. So the good news is that in coming weeks, we're going to take the first step. So the first thing we're going to do in October is we're going to start offering the opportunity to access the dining car to business class customers on the Coast Starlight. Now, I know that sounds like a really small population, but the idea is to start small and work through the issues that we inevitably will encounter by opening up the dining car to more customers. And then as that test is successful, then we will work to roll it out to additional markets.
Well, that's great news. I know there's a lot of coach passengers who look at the pictures that we post of the dining car meals and say, gee, I really wish I could eat that French toast. So that's really good news for everyone. Thank you, Roger. Our next question comes from Carl Fowler. Carl is a longtime board member of ours and an incredible lobbying force in his own right in Vermont, former travel tourism operator, so good industry experience as well. So we'll turn to Carl for the next question.
Good afternoon. My name is Carl Fowler. I'm a long-term member of the Rail Passengers Association and a past vice chair. And I have several questions for you folks, and we very much appreciate your taking them. When can we expect to see something approaching the Western cooked on board meals spread to the Eastern long-distance trains? I'd also like to know when we could expect to see the Crescent regain a proper dining car, and hopefully the Cardinal also gain such an accommodation. The other area that most concerns me is the matter of the consists and the capacity of the national network trains. Virtually every long-distance train seems to be being held at a very tight equipment status. Yet, Mr. Flynn at least commented a week or two ago that sleeping cars, for example, in the West were sold out virtually for the next 6 months. There ought to be some way that we could see the crew dormitory cars restored to service and additional rooms in those cars sold to the public, and we could see additional sleepers added to meet peak demand. You have the equipment. It is not a matter of lack of equipment. And if it is a matter of the reluctance to add another waiter in the dining car, if, as on the Southwest Chief, you can get over $1,000 a room between Chicago and Los Angeles in a base assignment basis now, you ought to be able to justify adding capacity to long-distance trains. These are, I think, exceptionally important matters to preserve the national network, and I hope that we can see them addressed shortly. Again, I thank you for the consideration of these concerns and wish you my best.
Thanks, Carl. Well, a lot of what you described is really tied up with the capacity constraints that we have in the mechanical shops at the moment. Due to the backlog that I described, which was intentional in the early point of the pandemic, and also the labor constraints that we have today. We are working to prioritize sleeping cars to address a lot of these issues that you described around crew dorms, et cetera, making sure that we don't have to continue to put employees in full sleeping cars, that employees have actually their own rest areas. So that's a priority, but it will require working through the winter to get a lot of those remaining sleeping cars. And by that, I mean also the dorm cars, the transition cars, back into service. As to your point about improving improving dining on the East Coast services, what we're doing is we're looking at those menu items on the West Coast traditional dining that work well, and we're also working with the food. We have a new food vendor that's helping us with a lot of menu items, including on Acela First Class, which has been very successful. The revised food service there. We're working with the food vendors to figure out what will work well within the constraints of the single level dining cars that we have on the East Coast, because they aren't the same as the superliners. And we also have a limited ability to put a lot more crew back onto the trains because we have limited sleeping car compartments for their dorm requirements. So East Coast food service is more complicated. but we're looking at, as I said, new menu items. We're looking at also putting on new types of ovens and other kitchen equipment so that we can be more creative in the types of food offerings that we have. Because one of the observations and some of the feedback that we've had from customers is that we have very repetitive food options, and it's partly limited by the format and the way that we offer the meal. So by trying to offer different types of foods, ones that are more appealing, we think that we can substantially upgrade the food offering on the East Coast.
Okay, thank you for that. And our final questions come from George Chilson, who is vice chair of our board.
I'm George Chilson, Chairman Emeritus and currently Vice Chair of the Rail Passenger Association from San Diego, California. My first question has to do with the purchase of equipment for the long distance routes. So far, nothing has really happened to replace superliners. And my question is, when will you issue an RFP, request for proposals? When do you expect to place an order? And is there a target date to begin the delivery of new equipment to replace what is worn out and obsolete? Second question is regarding the equipment that is currently being delivered from Siemens. Is this a prototype for some additional equipment that could be configured for overnight travel or longer distance trips? Those are my two questions, and I would appreciate it if you would address them. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Very good questions. These are early days yet, and so we don't have the answers to all of your questions. So we've just gone through a process of, we're basically replacing all of our fleet in the kind of, if you look back over the last 5 years and you look into the future, between the new Acellas, between the new venture cars that were ordered by the states, and between the new Siemens replacement for the Amfleet equipment on the Northeast Corridor. And then once you wrap up the long distance fleet, it will be the vast majority of the Amtrak rolling stock. And this is not something that Amtrak really has a deep bench on in terms of doing procurement. So we really need to tackle these sequentially. So there are some elements of the Amfleet replacements that we need to wrap up still from that procurement. And then we will begin to have the capacity to work on the long distance procurement. So we need to do a little bit of planning before we launch that process. And then I think realistically, the delivery timelines, when we think about the RFP, the procurement process, the engineering that needs to go into it, it will be probably late in the decade before you're going to see even the first of the new fleet coming in, whatever it may be. And I think there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty around the configuration, the builder, all the other things. So it really, at this point, isn't feasible, I think, to give a date. Regarding the most recent Siemens order that we've had with for the Northeast Corridor service, the Amfleet replacements, that's an entirely coach order. There may be elements of the platform that it's built on that can be reused for long distance in terms of from an engineering and parts perspective, but there really isn't any ability in our contract with Siemens to repurpose a part of the order for something that's so substantially different, partly because our procurement rules wouldn't allow it. We really would have to go out for a new procurement. But that said, procurement aside, there may be mechanical and parts and platform synergies between the what is the venture car platform that the ICTs are based on and a sleeping car, because in Europe they've done exactly this for OBB, the Austrian Federal Railways. they've built a sleeping car on the same platform that we're essentially procuring.
Okay, well, Roger, listen, I really appreciate your clearing some time to do this with us. As you know, our members are continuing to engage with Congress even now. Some critical votes are getting ready to happen. So having all of this top of mind as they do their meetings, I know is going to be super helpful to them as they continue to advocate for better passenger rail. So really, thanks so much for being here again, as you always are. And we look forward to continuing to work together to help make all this really exciting stuff a reality. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. And thanks to you and all of RPA for all the support that you've given us historically and continue to generously give us.